Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened to his neck. Frederick Douglass, slave abolitionist and statesman.
In the 1600s, the native people of Africa and the Caribbean were forcibly brought to the Americas and enslaved for the purpose of providing a free workforce. Slave owners applied brutal acts of dehumanization in attempts to physically and emotionally control slaves. But many of the captured people sought freedom, all the while knowing that a failed escape would cost them a severe whipping, a chopped off leg, or death at the end of a rope. From the slavery era through the civil rights era, there were persons empowered only with the love of their fellow man and moral fiber, who paid steep personal costs in their quest to empower the disenfranchised. These great Americans fought slavery, Jim Crow laws, and racism in order to free people from a hell on earth and to rescue America from her immoral agenda. Those heroes and heroines paid for our freedom. This is their story.
Generally, when people are asked about the history of African people in America, who we've called Ausa, the Ausa tribe, the Africans in the United States of America, the thoughts generally turn to slavery. And it's a shame that during our lowest point, people see as our beginning, not understanding that we had thousands of years of glorious history. And actually, if you look at the history of the world, for most of the history of the world, there was peace and African people were in charge. Starting from ancient Egypt, which is been said to be in some nebulous place called the Middle East. But I often ask, middle of what and east of where? There's no reference point given. So Egypt is in Africa. When I was blessed to be able to go there, even some Egyptians didn't want to admit that they were Africans until you went down to the southern part of Egypt. And then you saw the monuments that many had been defaced, and you understood that the oldest of all the monuments and the pictures and the paintings were African people, unequivocally African people. So I think that when you think about the origins of mathematics, the origins of architecture, the origins of spirituality and religion itself, they're all due to the efforts of African people. When the first European explorers traversed the coast of Africa in the 11th and 12th century, they found civilizations that were actually superior to much of what was going on in Europe at that time. When the first Europeans came, they welcomed them. They adopted them into their families. They treated them kindly. And the Europeans repaid by bringing in priests and teachers. And the teachers offered to educate the children, understanding that the children would be the ones who were the investment in the future. Frequently, they would even take them to Europe, to Portugal, to Spain, to France, and they would teach them to hate themselves. They would teach them that the features that made them uniquely African were ugly. The interesting thing is that after such a warm welcome, the Africans were repaid in treachery by, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke says, enslaving the father and the child, killing the father, enslaving the child, and raping the mother. And those people were brought to America to work for nothing. Many of them perished during the Middle Passage, which was the voyage from Africa to America. And it's very, very important that we realize that slaves were not brought from Africa. Africans were brought from Africa and turned into slaves. And the way they were doing that was a process called seasoning. And the Africans were beaten and they were humiliated. They were treated in all sorts of literally brutal ways in order to break their spirits. Generation after generation, I think there was something like 15 to 17 generations of Africans who were enslaved. And those Africans underwent tremendous trauma.
I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one or two things I had a right to: liberty and death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. Harriet Tubman, slave abolitionist, freedom fighter.
But just think about 17 generations of living under barbaric conditions where your wife was not your wife, where your children could be sold away from you at any time, where on a whim you could be beaten, where on a whim you could be raped as well as your wife and your children. And there was absolutely nothing you could do about it.
Denmark Vesey, a slave in Charleston, South Carolina, purchased his freedom and then plotted to free slaves in Charleston, South Carolina, and sailed to Haiti. Before the revolt could be carried out, two slaves loyal to their owner reported the plot. On July the 2nd, 1822, Vesey and 34 of his supporters were hanged.
I think it's important to recognize that America's foundation rests on the institution of enslavement. I think the notion of American democracy, it is impossible to fully understand what that meant over time without understanding how slavery helped shape and develop our nation. I mean, slavery helped build the United States of America. It was a source of tremendous wealth for generations of white Americans. And so many people, as they envisioned power, as they envisioned themselves, they did not see that apart from the enslavement of millions of Africans. And so when one looks at the wealth of plantations, but not only that, the wealth of railroads, the wealth of banks, all of that rests on the profit driven from the exploitation of millions of African people.
White people's defense of the institution of slavery was based on the twin lies: white superiority, black inferiority. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to its own constitution. Frederick Douglass.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure half slave, half free. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States of America, June 16, 1858.
The real fear of the Confederates was the emancipation of black minds, black identities, black spirits, because that would prove the lie to the notion of inferiority. And so the fear was the President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would be enforced, and that African Americans would elect, they would exercise their own independence, as many did, to be free people. And free people meant having access to education. Free people meant having access to the right to vote. It also meant property ownership. It meant the right for your own labor, your own wages. Because here you now have white people who are trying to preserve what they once had, which was the root of their identity. And here you have black people who are trying to move themselves away from generations of enslavement. And they are the majority of those who are emancipated. And so it is no irony that in the aftermath of the fall of the Confederacy, you have the rise of paramilitary organizations, you have the rise of militias, you have the rise of rifle clubs, and you have the rise of this extraordinary fraternity called the Ku Klux Klan, which was initially a reunion of Confederate soldiers who made it a point to exercise violence to try to circumscribe black rights and black aspirations. And you can see over time, they began to realize that the only way to curtail black freedom, you cannot do it at the ballot box. You cannot do it necessarily in the schoolhouse. But they thought and were proven successful that you could exercise a reign of terror on black people to strike up fear, to strike up unrest. And in places like South Carolina and Mississippi and other places where you have black majorities, that is how you unraveled Reconstruction.
We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed him to be the equal of the white man, and we will not submit to his gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him. Benjamin R. Pitchfork Tillman, South Carolina Governor and U.S. Senator, March 23, 1900.
The thriving black enclave of Tulsa, commonly called Greenwood or Black Wall Street, bolstered its own hospital and over 200 businesses. May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a black man, is accused of assaulting a white woman and is arrested. When the sheriff refuses to release Rowland to a mob of 2,000 whites, the mob goes on a rampage in Greenwood, burning 1,200 homes and looting another 250. Churches and 200 businesses are destroyed and 6,000 black residents arrested. The total number of deaths, white and black, vary from 33 to 300.
Blacks in Omaha, Nebraska are prospering. Competition for jobs between ethnic groups is fierce and racial tensions are at a boil. The local newspaper sensationalizes the alleged rape of a white woman by Will Brown, a black man, and Brown is arrested. Sunday, September 28, 1919, a white mob of about 4,000 takes Brown from his jail cell, hangs him, and burns his body. How long did it take for members of Will Brown's family to recover from the atrocity? When this boy became a man, did he resist teaching hatred to his own son?
The 2001 investigative report, Torn from the Land, by Associated Press writers Todd Lewin and Dolores Barclay, provides graphic and indisputable proof of how violent white land grabbers, dishonest white lawyers, and a legal but controversial practice called partitioning robbed blacks of their land.
For whom the bell tolls, no man is an island entire to itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a piece of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, sin not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Sir John Donne's powerful poem reminds us that we are one, and when one dies, we all die a little. And likewise, when one of us triumphs, we all profit. The bell doesn't toll to mark the death of a community servant, but instead to honor his or her death and to challenge the next generation to a life of service.
Mr. Harry T. Moore and his wife, Harriet Moore, founded the Brevard County, Florida chapter of the NAACP and committed their lives to fighting injustice. The cost of their commitment was death. On Christmas night, 1951, their 25th wedding anniversary, the Ku Klux Klan firebombed their home, killing them both. No one was ever prosecuted for the murders.
I'm Cresswell Elmore. My father was George Elmore, the middle initial A, as he liked to be referred to. My father was a very successful entrepreneur. He started a number of